Ladies and gentlemen, welcome and thank you for joining today's web conference, Market Surveillance Committee meeting. Please note that all participant lines are muted. If you would like to ask a question throughout the conference, please press #2 on your telephone keypad. You'll hear a notification when your line is unmuted, and then please state your name and your question and your affiliation. If you require technical assistance, send a note to the event producer or call our help desk at 888-796-6118. And with that, I'll turn the call over to Dr. Benjamin Hobbs, Chair of the Market Surveillance Committee. Go ahead, Dr. Benjamin.
Okay, thank you, and good morning, everybody. As always, we have important topics that each could take up a full meeting, but we have about an hour and a half or so apiece. RMR, CPM, local market power mitigation in the afternoon, and then finally the day ahead, market enhancements. But before we get to the meat of the agenda, first, as always, open the lines and the mics for public comment, preferably on issues that are not on the agenda. If you could keep your powder dry for that later on. But if for some reason you can't join us for the later agenda item, that we would welcome your comment at this time. So first, I will check to see whether within the room we have anybody who would like to make a public comment or ask a question. This is exactly the response I get in class when I ask a question. Everybody looks at their hands. Okay, operator, is there anybody on the phone lines who would like to make a public comment or question?
There are no questions right now at this time. Once again, #2 will indicate that you wish to ask a question over the phone.
Okay, thank you very much. Jim suggested that we use a standard class technique of cold calling on people. Okay, I want to comment, but I will refrain. Okay, the next item on the agenda is a decision on the general session minutes from December 7th. And Jim and Scott, you have a copy of the minutes in front of you. I would entertain a motion to accept the minutes.
I move to accept the minutes.
I second the motion.
Okay. Dr. Bushnell has moved to accept the minutes, and Dr. Harvey has seconded that. Any corrections or anything else? I see head shaking, so I'll take a vote. Jim?
Yes.
Scott?
Yes.
And I vote yes. Okay, so we're ready to roll the first item on the agenda. And by the way, I forgot to introduce my colleagues here. So those of you who don't, Dr. Scott Harvey and Dr. Jim Bushnell, all of us are here in person. So we will start with a presentation on RMR and CPM enhancements by Keith Johnson. So we have...
Yeah, he wants to make an entrance, so he'll be coming in.
Okay. Yeah, that's right. So he has a presentation of approximately 20 slides. And we'll have plenty of time for discussion. This is supposed to go through the morning. We will be preparing an opinion on this for consideration by both the EIM board and the ISO board, which would be the EIM board is not considering this? Okay. Okay, thank you. All right, Keith's here. And it's all yours.
Okay, thank you. Good morning, all. So today we're going to talk about reliability must run and capacity procurement mechanism. We have a stakeholder initiative underway. We're proposing some enhancements to that. They'll be going to the board for the March board meeting, which is March 27th and 28th. We've asked the MSC for an opinion that would go with that material, as well as our filing to FERC. So we wanted to talk today at the MSC about this subject. We've been to the MSC a couple of times before, talking about some of the other items that are within the proposal. Let me just quickly provide kind of an overview of the proposal. It does have a number of elements in it, about a dozen or so. that range from particular items within the RMR construct as well as the CPM construct. And we're proposing making some changes there. I guess at a high level, I would say that we are not proposing wholesale changes to the RMR structure, if you will, in the sense of, the compensation, for example, nor are we proposing wholesale changes to the compensation structure for the capacity procurement mechanism. In the case of the CPM, we do have an item that we think is needed to be looked at, which is updating the way the formula works for a price that can be bid into the competitive solicitation process. For the CPM, we think that that's an item that needs to be looked at because of the current methodology is something that does not really appear to be optimal. So we are looking at updating the pricing for a bid into the CSP for a resource that would have costs above the soft offer cap, which they would file at FERC to get approval of that price, and that's the price we would use as far as based compensation on. So as far as CPM, that's really the one change that we're proposing. Under the RMR compensation construction, we are looking at updating the rate of return, for example, that is allowed under the RMR agreement. But again, not a wholesale change in the way the RMR compensation works. And so we'll get into that. But I wanted to kind of set the stage and explain kind of what we're talking about. And so what we thought would be the most helpful from this MSC is to really talk about compensation, which is among their many bailiwicks that they are very good at. But we thought that rather than talk about some of the other items in the proposal, so for example, we have some administrative type enhancements to RMR, like banking issues or the way that settlements is done and the payment calendar and that type of thing. We thought that it would be best to spend the valuable time of the MSC really talking about compensation. So with that, I want to talk about CPM compensation, two pieces of that. The first one is just compensation in general for CPM resources. As I mentioned earlier, we're not suggesting it needs to be completely changed, but we did think that this was a good opportunity to provide the context for how CPM works, as well as how RMR works and how the compensation is set up now and why it is like it is. And then on number 2, under the CPM on this slide, certainly want to talk about this methodology that I mentioned earlier, where we do think that it would be good to change the formula from its current formula. And then on the RMR side, wanted to, again, talk about compensation for RMR resources, how that construct exists at the ISO and why it looks the way it does. And then also wanted to talk a little bit on number 4 about bidding rules for RMR resources, because one of the things we're proposing for RMR is to have a must-offer obligation on RMR resources. And so if there is a must-offer obligation, there's certain bidding rules that we are proposing be used. So with that, I wanted to take a couple slides here just to provide an overview context for the discussion. Then I'll get into the first topic of RMR, then I open it up for discussion among the MSC members and the public. So in our proposal, what we're suggesting is that we would retain both the RMR and the CPM backstop procurement mechanisms. We think that each of those has specific purposes that are a little different. And I would say that in our stakeholder process, we've had some stakeholders suggest that maybe we don't need both. Is it possible to eliminate one, maybe just have one backstop procurement? In our view, both are appropriate. From a high level, what we would say is that the RMR is, the CPM is really used to backstop the RA program. And what we mean by that is there's certain authorities that we have to invoke use of a CPM. For example, if there are RA showings and there's a deficiency where there isn't enough capacity shown to meet the RA requirement, we have the ability to see. So in that sense, you're backstopping the RA program. Whereas in the RMR paradigm, And what we're trying to do in this initiative is to kind of draw a brighter line than exists today about when do you use RMR, when do you use the CPM, and what we're suggesting is that if you look at it and what we were proposing to now use it, the RMR is really used to address resource retirements and to provide an RMR agreement for an interim period of time until, for example, the transmission system perhaps then can be reconfigured so that we don't need to have a resource under an RMR agreement. So under RMR, we have a compensation structure which we think needs to be driven by the fact that the procurement under RMR is mandatory. If we need an RMR unit, the unit can't decline that service, whereas CPM, for example, is a voluntary circumstance. A little bit of background on the CPM. We do have a competitive solicitation process, which is basically an auction-like mechanism that resources can bid into to provide services to us. And if they have submitted a bid into that and we do accept that bid, CPM is not voluntary because in that sense, the resource has said, I'll provide service at a certain price, and if we say, okay, we like that price, we accept that price, then they can't say, no, I've changed. If a bid is not submitted into the competitive solicitation process, we do have the ability to offer the resource a CPM designation at the soft offer cap price, and they can decline that because they haven't voluntarily, submitted a bid. So that's a distinction within the CPM of how it works. Just one other thing from an overview perspective, we are suggesting and are proposing that we would be changing the RMR construct so that RMR resources going forward, once approved by FERC, would have a must-offer obligation. They would also have performance mechanism, a performance incentive mechanism, using the one that we have for RA and CPM resources, which is called the Resource Adequacy Availability Incentive, or RAIM. So that's kind of a high-level overview of the use of RMR and CPM. We've used this diagram in our stakeholder meetings in the past, and I see that most of the folks in the room here are familiar with that, so I'll try not to spend too much time on that. But what we're trying to illustrate here on the CPM side on the left and the RMR side on the right is really the differences. So on the CPM side, we're really illustrating the example that if, in fact, we offered CPM designations to folks, they can either accept them or decline them depending on the type of designation that we are trying to do. In other words, if they'd submitted a bid, they certainly can't decline the designation. But if they haven't and we offer them a price at the soft offer cap, they could decline. So what we're illustrating here is that there is a decision tree, if you will, and we would continue to offer a designation to resources until we ran out of resources in the stack, if you will, or the need that we had. And it is possible that they could turn it down. All of the resources could turn it down. And what we're suggesting here is this notion of the brighter line between CPM and RMR for the future is that, we're not going to automatically then just jump to offering a resource that turned down a CPM, an RMR agreement, that we would have a more formal process that they would need to go through. If they wanted to retire then because they're really not being picked up in a capacity contract world of the bilateral world or the CPM, they could submit a retirement request to the ISO and they'd be considered for an RMR. If the resource is really not interested in retiring, submitting a retirement notification, in other words, the resource is going to continue to be operating and on the system. What we're suggesting is we wouldn't offer it an RMR contract, and the resource would still be available if it was needed to accept dispatch or other uses consistent with the PGA requirements, the participating generator agreement requirements that the resource has as a participant with the ISO and as a feature, if you will, a part of the grid. On the RMR side, if a resource owner does submit a request for retirement, we can consider then whether or not it's really needed on the system, we would do a study, and if the resource was not needed for reliability, the resource is allowed to retire. This is a standard thing that the ISO does. Resources have been, resources retire. They have retired over the years. We always do a study to make sure that we can reliably operate the grid. If a resource is going to retire, we need to give them permission, if you will, to retire on the date that they are requesting. But if they can't, we have in the past and would in the future put them under an RMR contract if they were absolutely needed, and they would then be on a year-to-year RMR contract until we could reconfigure the grid. So that's kind of the overview. Let me go into the compensation, and then I'll kind of open it up for discussion.
Yes. Yeah. So with regard to the last slide and that path, I just wanted to ask.
Excuse me, just for the folks in the line,
oh, okay.
I can identify yourself.
Sorry, Michelle Kiedis from Cpuc, previous slide.
This one, right?
Yeah. So I'm concerned about the mothball. So you kind of have a bright line, but it's not really a bright line, and I'm concerned about that not really a bright line. So my question is, let's say I just say I'm going to mothball and for some indefinite time. You will study it for an RMR, right? That's
correct.
Okay. But then what if I decide that indefinite period of time is 0? Is there any...
So in our draft final proposal that was posted a couple of days ago, we have added new requirements for a mothball resource where they're not going to have to fulfill certain requirements, including telling us they have to have an affidavit, they're going to have to tell us when they want a mothball, and that if they want to return from mothballing, they're then going to have to justify why they're returning, what circumstances have changed that would allow them to return. So we're trying to strengthen that. And in the attestation, when they mothball, they're going to need to explain, why they've made this business decision to mothball.
Okay. So with regard to mothball and retirement, so I like the idea that you have a retirement process. I'm concerned that if you don't ask them why they're retiring, so what if they are fully economic, they're just not to because they want to go the market power route. Will you ask them if they're economic? Will there be some tests? Will you have them open their book?
We are not proposing to do an economic test.
Okay. So you've had instances where resources have asked to retire this year, for example, and then they've rescinded the retirement notice. So you don't think that will occur? Or change their retirement date?
I'm sorry, I don't understand the question.
So Ormond Beach, I guess in the beginning of the year, said that it was going to retire units 1 and 2. Ormond Beach 2 was going to be designated an RMR. They received a contract through Edison, and then they decided not to retire their other unit. Is that right?
Ormond Beach said that they were planning to retire. We did a study. We found that they may be needed for RMR, and the unit would subsequently entered into RA contracts with Edison, I believe. Is that the scenario you're discussing?
Yeah, one of the units, but the other unit rescinded its retirement notice. It wasn't needed for RMR, but decided to retire later. Is that right?
I'm not familiar with that one. Michelle, if you'd like, I can get the transmission planning folks in here that have the details of all the units on the system.
Okay. I'm just concerned about people saying they're going to retire and then not retiring. So I believe other jurisdictions have requirements that you actually have to demonstrate that you are on the path to retirement. And so I'm just concerned that there's not that here. So with regards to CPM, I have a couple of questions. So on the CPMs that we did for Encina and Moss Landing, it's a competitive solicitation process. Were there other resources that could have met that need?
I don't know.
Well, again, I think I do.
I can get the transmission folks in here if you'd like to have a more detailed discussion.
Okay, well, I think it's important because I think that it's fine if it's a competitive solicitation process, but if it's only one, then it's not really a competitive solicitation process. So I'm concerned about people choosing one or the other, and I don't think that the thresholds are high enough to prevent people from moving into one of these or the other.
So I can comment on Encina. So Encina is a 12-month CPM designation that we did. It's the only time in the 8 or so years that we've had CPM authority where we've ever done a 12-month designation. And the reason that Encina was procured and there was a deficiency that needed to be procured was that the largest load-serving entity in San Diego was told that it could not procure the Encina unit, and so it did not. And so the Encina unit was not picked up. So in that circumstance, that was a particular circumstance where the unit was not picked up under our.
So I would like to clarify that Ormond Beach submitted Encina submitted a retirement notice to you, and in the local study, there are other LSEs in the area, and none of it was picked up. So I just, I get that you want to say that it was San Diego's fault, but I think it's more complicated than that.
I did not say it was San Diego's fault.
Okay, and then the other one for the year-round was Moss Landing. So just wondering, was there another option in the South Bay Moss Landing area?
Go ahead, Anthony.
Yeah, Anthony, I think, with the ISO. I also want to clarify on Moss Landing. That was primarily a collective deficiency. All of the LSEs most of the LSEs met their RA local procurement requirements, except for a couple of megawatts in a couple of months. And we ended up procuring it because we needed that particular resource and that particular location. So it was really more of what we call a collective deficiency, not folks opting in and out of RA and RMR and CPM. Again, folks, LSCs for the most part met their RA obligations there.
Yeah, I understand that. I think my point is that it's not competitive. So I get that we have a retirement process here, and I think that we have a backstop process, but I also think we have to think about a market power process. So in our comments, we talked about that, the anti-toggling provisions to keep people from moving from one to another. And one way to do that is clawback of revenues, and one way is to have a higher bar to get through the door. So that's my comment.
Okay, and we can talk about that some more. I just wanted to set the stage and let the MSCs talk more generally about the compensation here, and certainly they can continue to talk about that. I know that toggling is something folks may want to talk about today. So let me keep going just with a quick overview, and then we can kind of open up the discussion. So just for folks, this is just a slide to provide a high-level conceptual view of how CPM works. You've got the three different circumstances on the far left where a bid can be submitted, and if it's below the soft offer cap, there's not an issue with the bid being viewed as valid, if you will. There is a soft offer cap price, and that's the price I'd mentioned that the ISO can offer resources if there aren't bids, and we would like to make a designation. And that's calculated based on a reference resource, and I've provided some information there about the reference resource and how that's calculated. And then finally, there is the ability for resources to submit bids above the soft offer cap, and they are based on a certain formula, which is the box on the far right, and in the bottom right, you can see what the current methodology is, which is actually more of a cost of service type of situation where they would use Schedule F of the RMR agreement. So in all of the cases here, for CPM, one of the features of the CPM is that the unit that is designated gets to keep all of the market rents that are earned. And so one of the things that we're trying to do and we'll talk about under number 2 of these slides is that bottom right-hand box where we're proposing to update the pricing for a bid above the soft offer cap. So what we wanted to talk a little bit about here, and I'll open it up for discussion here, is we just really wanted to talk more generally about with the MSC about the competitive solicitation, the capacity procurement mechanism, and really get their thoughts. We can have a discussion here today about really the construct of how folks can competitively bid capacity below the soft offer cap price. The CSP is set up so that we would get bids and that we would choose the lowest cost bids, and that then if folks are allowed to keep their market rents, we would expect them that they would be competitively bidding energy if they're able to keep their market revenues so that they would be selected and could earn earnings that way, and we would have the energy being used efficiently. So wanted to stop there, and we can talk about the soft offer cap, but if folks want to talk more generally about the slides thus far or CPM and how CPM works, happy to do so.
Yeah, at the very beginning of this process, we had asked for us to relook at the CPM pricing, but CAISO didn't want to. But just from a design perspective, can you explain to me why you would do going forward costs plus a 20% adder plus keeping market rents? So market rents should be your opportunity to get money from the market, but guaranteeing them the 20% over and above the going forward fixed cost. Can you explain the rationale?
Sounds like you want to talk about number 2 already, the next one. Anthony, do you want to answer the question?
Can you repeat it? They should have sidewalk compensation. Very important.
Well, she asked about why we would advocate going forward fixed cost plus 20% plus keep market rents for a CPM.
Okay, so this goes back to in 2010, the ISO proposed to set the CPM price at going forward cost plus 10%. FERC came back and rejected that and said it was insufficient because it wasn't providing a greater opportunity for CPM resources to recover their fixed costs and to do things like, major maintenance, capital upgrades, environmentally related upgrades, and things like that. So we came back at the time and proposed and filed it for going forward costs plus 20%. FERC accepted that. In 2015, it was time to make another CPM filing at FERC, and the stakeholders, basically all the parties in this room and everybody else, got together and actually settled the issue, and we filed at FERC a settlement that basically set the CPM offer cap at going forward costs plus 20%, and for any costs above the cap, they were allowed to recover their full cost of service. FERC issued an order. They did not treat it as a settlement, but instead treated it as a regular 205 filing, and they found it just and reasonable that the soft offer cap be set at going forward costs plus 20%. And the reason, again, was going back to their prior order in 2010, that it provided a better opportunity for resources to recover some of their fixed costs through CPM, which they thought was appropriate and necessary.
Okay, and I guess I get what FERC said. I'm asking from a design perspective. So going forward fixed costs should include going forward capital expenditures. So I'm just asking why you would allow them to get the 20% guaranteed. I mean, FERC also says that recovery in a market is you have an opportunity, not a guarantee. So I guess I'm wondering, I get why you would do the 20% for a fully depreciated asset, but for a fully economic asset, I'm not understanding why you would cover all of that.
Going forward costs do not include capital costs. All they include insurance, ad valorem taxes, and fixed O&M. There is no fixed cost.
Which is reflected on the bottom, in that middle box in the bottom there, that we've laid out the components of the going forward fixed costs.
Okay, I don't think we're going to resolve this here. I'll just say that I think that having the 20% adder and recovery of market rents is double counting. Thanks.
The issue here is it's not going forward costs. It's a subset of going forward costs. And if you say, should they get a subset of going forward costs and then some other, there clearly is a need to get, if it's not all the going forward costs, they need additional revenues. And
I guess disagree.
So let me
about is it a competitive market is important, because if it's a competitive process, then we should rely on the competition to give us the sort of offers that we need to elicit the resource. Now, if it's not competitive, then we have the RMR framework where we impose a regulated rate of return,
right,
which is the traditional.
They're not using RMR for the non-competitive process. They're using RMR for the retirement process. There is no market power mitigation mechanism here. There's either the CSP, we assume it's competitive, or there's a retirement process. There's nothing else.
Right. Maybe they should have been using RMR if that was appropriate here.
Well, I mean, de facto, this formula is playing the role of the market power mitigation. Now, you're arguing it's inadequate, I think. So it sounds like the 20% on top of this definition of going forward fixed cost, which is not my sort of, before I learned about what you were counting, it's not what I would have thought, is meant to sort of proxy for the capital expenditures that might be necessary for truly going forward. Was there ever consideration of trying to just sort of look at that and see whether the 20% of this number, how that relates, or because it sounds like some of the debate here is that, well, you know, some plants are going to have capital expenditures to actually stay open, and therefore just this GFCC is not enough. Other plants, it may be enough, and so we're just going to give everybody 20% of this number and hope that sort of lines up right. It seems like another approach would have been to look at the actual capital expenditures in some way and see how those line up, which is kind of more kicking us into RMR world, but I'm just wondering what the thought process was there.
Well, Jim, I'm not sure whether you're talking about the soft offer cap and its calculation or the proposal, which we've kind of jumped to about the different pricing for the...
Well, so to a first order, right, the proposal is basically eliminating the right box here, right?
So let me just go through that real quick then, so that folks can, since we seem to have kind of bitten off the whole thing, we are suggesting, as far as the new methodology for determining the price, is that we would file, and we talk about this in our paper, that we would propose a primary proposal in our filing at FERC and include alternate tariff sheets, where there would also be an option if FERC did not agree with our primary, where they could go with our alternate. But the primary proposal would be, the unit would be able to file at FERC for its going forward fixed cost of that unit, not some reference unit, but that unit, using the same cost categories as the reference unit. So again, what is in going forward fixed costs? Ad valorem, insurance, and fixed operation and maintenance costs. And they get to keep all of their market rents. And so the reason for that, we talked in our slide here, I think we talked a little bit about it, and Mark, I'm sorry, I remember you had your hand up, but let me keep going and then we'll get to you first. We discussed here on this slide why we believe that the 20% adder could be found to be just and reasonable. And we are thinking that it makes more sense in the CPM side of the ledger, if you will, where we're having all of the resources on more or less a going forward fixed cost basis, rather than having like it is today, where that price above the soft offer cap is really a cost of service type. And then the other thing I think we did mention and we've committed to is that in 2019, this year, we will start a stakeholder process to talk about updating the CPM soft offer cap, which is something that's in our tariff and envisions that we would be doing that. One of the things involved with that is performing a very detailed cost study, like was done establishing the other soft offer cap. And then there's also been an issue raised in the stakeholder process about CPMs that would be long duration, like 12 months, and what should the compensation for those be. So we're committing to include that in that second stakeholder process that we will have. And then the alternate proposal that we would float at FERC, again, if FERC says that they do not agree with the primary, would be that it would be going forward fixed costs, keep all the market rents, but there would be no adder. And one of the reasons that we're suggesting that is that we have seen some FERC orders that on other matters where FERC seems to be saying that if you have a voluntary procurement mechanism, you only need to provide recovery of going forward fixed costs at a minimum, Okay? So I just want to remind everybody, we can look at other FERC orders when we think about CPM, but we're the only ISO that has anything like a CPM. Other ISOs have things that are RMR-like, but we have a CPM that's unique and different. So you have to be careful when you read FERC orders where they're talking about things like RMRs when you're talking about our CPM. So there. And so so I'm kind of teeing up here with the MSC is, okay, let's talk about adders. If we need one, Is an adder needed? And if an adder is needed, how would you compute one? What would it look like? What would it cover? What would be the basis of it? So let me do this, Anthony, before you look like you want to jump in, but Mark, I feel bad that I missed you earlier.
Wait, before we get started, I just want to remind everybody, please announce your name and the affiliation before you ask your question. Thank you.
Hi, it's Mark Smith. I'm with Calpine Corporation. So the three of you now have been exposed to the debates we've been having for the last 6 months about cost recovery. We're here, at least on this particular issue, because the CPM formula that historically and currently is in the tariff allows an entity to file for its full cost of service plus keep its market revenues. I think a point of an agreement for everyone in this room is probably that collecting your full cost of service and market revenues probably needs to change. Okay, so I think everybody, let's start from that point of agreement. I think that the question in front of you should be, and Michelle has actually illustrated this point, I think, pretty clearly, that there are local areas that are getting tighter and tighter and will continue to get tighter, and units will become more and more pivotal in terms of reliability in those areas. And I think the question that I would like to ask you is, under those circumstances, what is the right mitigation measure? And is it a mitigation measure that should allow a free competitive bidding up to the full cost of service, which is what I would argue should be the mitigation, or should that mitigation measure be some lower and, I think admittedly, according to everybody in this room, maybe even FERC, an arbitrary adder onto just the going forward costs? And, you know, I'd like to hear your opinions on that. I think if a unit is pivotal and it's needed for reliability, the mitigation cap should be its full cost of service. And I'd like to hear your opinions on that. I will add one more point before I turn it over to you guys. And that is that the ISO has flip-flopped a couple of times in their drafts, and I understand their dilemma, and I understand why they have. I don't remember which draft it was, Keith. It was the second revised, or which one it was, suggested the simplest solution here, which is the units should be allowed to bid up to the full cost of service, but they must return any market revenues back to the transmission owner that's paying the full cost of service for that unit. That was what we recommended. That seemed to make sense to us.
And Mark, the only thing I'd add to that, the one caveat that we discovered when we were looking into that was we would need to then buy the whole unit under a CPM at that, because we couldn't break the revenues apart, but for clawing it back. So there was that was one other nuance to it, whereas with a proposal for above the soft offer where you'd be doing going forward fixed cost plus a 20% adder, it looked like we could procure only the amount of that unit that we needed, not the whole unit.
Yeah, another thing I think I want to put in perspective here is that in this initiative, we are not looking at changing the existing level of the CPM soft offer cap. Under our tariff, we're required to do a cost of service study to change that. And we have not done that cost of service study in this initiative. It's something we are going to start and do this year. So we really, if we were to follow our tariff, we cannot change the existing soft offer cap. What we are proposing to do is, I think as Mark alluded to, is change the cost recovery above that cap, and we're changing it from full cost of service recovery, plus you retain your revenues, and we're basically changing it to going forward costs plus 20%, plus you retain your revenues, which basically parallels how the existing soft offer cap is set. And that's our primary proposal here. And I think there's a number of problems. For example, a lot of CPM designations are not for a full unit's capacity, which makes it extremely difficult when you start clawing back revenues on a unit that's only part CPM and part something else. And it's just a lot easier, at least from an implementation perspective, that you basically allow them to keep their revenues and you either give them going forward costs plus keep their revenues, or give them going forward costs plus the 20% adder and they keep their revenues. And we've opted for the latter because, one, we think that parallels the way the cap is set today, and two, consistent with the specific guidance that FERC has given us that you need to be paying these resources more than just their going forward costs so they can get some fixed cost recovery. And I think the final point I want to make is that, the cap as it exists today is based on a mid-cost combined cycle unit. So it's not based on the sort of most expensive resource out there, but also, and this is something that FERC said, in addition to allowing these units to recover their chance to recover their going forward costs and a chance to get some fixed cost recovery, the cap also needs to be set at a level that's going to discourage LSEs from leaning on the CPM instead of entering into RA contracts, and that was a clear message in their 2015 order. So we're trying to balance a lot of these different factors into this. And picking up on Mark, this just hasn't been debated for the last 6 months. Quite honestly, this debate, unfortunately, I was involved in the original debate back in 2004 and 2005, and has been going on for like 14 or 15 years at this point, not 6 months. So.
We do have a comment on the phone, so maybe we could go to that.
Okay, first comment on the line. Go ahead. Your line is unmuted.
Hi, this is Peter Griffiths with PG&E. I've got a series of questions because this is really the first time you've come to the phones. And I guess my first question is can you come to the phones a little more often to make sure that the people who don't have the ability to attend in person can express their opinion and ask questions?
Yes, we will. Sorry, Peter. We will.
Yeah, thank you for that. I know the discussion in the room oftentimes gets pretty heated and gets going, and it's easy to forget about those people who are not in the room, but there are stakeholders who are not able to be in the room, and so we appreciate the fact of being able to weigh in. My questions, I have a couple of here. One is, and most of them are for the MSC. The ISO has asked you to write an opinion on this stakeholder process, and I guess the question I have for the MSC is what is the scope of that opinion going to be? The presentation that the ISO has prepared for you today has been pretty much focused on the compensation and the pricing of that. And I was just wondering if the MSC was intending to essentially limit its opinion to simply the compensation that has been put forward or to the issues that the ISO has requested specifically.
We don't, Peter, this is Ben, we don't feel that we have to limit ourselves to just what the ISO puts to us. Looking at the stakeholder comments are obviously a great range of concerns, but also we know we can't address all of them, so those to which we can actually be helpful with will be the ones that we'll address. But it's not necessarily limited to what we're seeing today, that's for sure.
Okay.
Peter, is there a specific aspect that you are that you think we should be addressing that wasn't on that list?
Yeah, I got to say, certainly the process itself may need a bigger look, and it has to do with one of my questions, and that has to do with transparency. Certainly in the exchange between Anthony and Michelle, Anthony was making assertions that may well be true, but for which there is no public knowledge. Sort of the way it works is that in the CPM process, we only know about it, publicly know about what's going on in the CPM process when the ISO makes the CPM call. And the CPM process, for the most part, has a lot to do with when there are deficiencies and when there are not deficiencies, and the deficiencies that are made up, and there's a cure period. But the ISO doesn't report out, in any sort of public way, what deficiencies are actually existing. Certainly, they make the deficiency report at the end of the year for the following year, in November, they put the deficiency report out that says, this is what is deficient. However, there is a cure period that the LSCs are allowed essentially to make up those deficiencies. And so, Anthony pretty much said that there, just in the case of Moss, we don't have a real clear picture as to exactly what happened where that is. And so, we don't know how many of the deficiencies are made up, how many of the deficiencies are left. The ISO tariff is very clear that the ISO does not have the requirement to essentially to make up a deficiency when it sees one in a local area. The tariff basically reads the ISO may CPM. They are not required to CPM. And so, for instance, for the 2019 RA, the deficiency report that came out in November said that there was something like a 120-some megawatt deficiency in a local area, and essentially that's what the last thing the ISO has said about that deficiency. We understand that there was not a CPM, otherwise there would have been a public notice about the CPM, but there hasn't been any transparency about sort of how much was CPM'd, what the decision was about whether or not, how that deficiency was made up. And I guess from our perspective, we think that transparency might be a good thing here in terms of having some sort of idea of how this mechanism is working. It adds a lot of uncertainty to the fact that, the fact that the bids are made without having sort of any sort of knowledge of how those bids will be looked at or how those bids will be responded to. So I guess from our perspective, the ISO hasn't put on the table the question of transparency anywhere in the stakeholder process. And from our perspective, it's an important aspect of trying to set prices and how prices are set and what the incentives are for participants to react to the rules that are set forward. So I guess that's a long-winded way of saying that we would appreciate it if the MSC were to take a look at sort of what the historic performance has been of the CPM and the RMR, and think about also and weigh in on the importance of transparency and providing information to market participants about what the results are.
Keith, can I just follow up, just to clarify in my own mind? The CPM sort of, there's two pathways. There's the LFEs with local RA requirements, for some reason, don't buy enough. And so there's kind of this aggregate shortfall within the local RA region that would trigger potentially a CPM. And then there's also everybody actually meets the local RA requirements, but it's actually those local RA requirements aren't granular enough to meet what the ISO considers to be a reliability need. And so you need to sort of substitute in a way that the wrong local units have been acquired is another sort of put it. And I guess my memory is that there's never been, or if that's a correct characterization, I'm wondering how much of procurement has been under it's the wrong place kind of, we need a special unit model. My understanding is it's the vast majority, if not exclusive, has been in that channel. Is that
so? Jim, you've described it pretty well. I guess I would only add that I think what you're describing is a prescribed use of CPM, which is for an RA showing deficiency. That's what it's referred to as in the tariff. It can occur in a couple of ways. There could be an individual deficiency where an individual LSC did not procure the number of megawatts that equaled the megawatts of its RA requirement. So that would be an individual deficiency in a local area, for example. We'll take the local case. And then since LSEs are not required to buy the most effective units that are identified in the list that goes with the local study that is published each year for each local area, because of concerns with market power, LSEs are allowed to buy any unit that's within a local area. They're not forced to buy the most effective ones.
Well, okay, so let me just, do they know which is the most effective?
Correct. It's the effectiveness factors are in the LCR report that's published each year. So they're not required to buy the most effective units, and so what the second pass that's done of local RA showing is to see whether or not we do a study, a quick study of what the resources that we procured to see if there is any additional capacity that we would need. That, presumably it's a small amount because they didn't quite buy the perfect resources. That's referred to as a collective deficiency. And then the only time in the history of CPM that we've ever done an RA showing deficiency was for this year. It happened December last year for the Encina unit because it was not procured on RA showings. Among the reasons was that the largest LSC in that area was not allowed to buy Encina, so it did not. So we ended up with, in the end, for that year, the RA showings had both an individual deficiency and a collective deficiency, and it was spread around the LSCs.
Point of question for Keith. The Moss Landing was not a collective deficiency?
I do not know, Peter. I'd have to have the transmission folks, or maybe Anthony may know.
Yeah, and I guess that just highlights my point that to some degree we're trying to design the compensation, but do we really know sort of what the incentives are and the circumstances under which it's being used? And so the fact that Keith, that you're not sure, that could weigh into sort of how the pricing incentives might work. And, that's why from PG&E's perspective, we would like the MSC to take a look at that and to weigh in on the transparency.
Moss Landing was primarily a collective deficiency. Again, there were a couple of small LSCs that were a couple of megawatts short in a couple of months, but it was primarily a collective deficiency. And the ISO would have made that clear in reports, and we filed pleadings at FERC explaining that clearly.
And Anthony, I don't doubt that might be in some of the filings, but it's only when you're making the call for the CPM. It's when you don't make the call for the CPM that I'm concerned about. Because from my perspective, there was a deficiency of some 120 megawatts in the local area for 2019 that has not yet been made up.
Hey, this is Tyrone, and maybe to give.
Hey, Peter, this is Scott. I just want to make sure I understand. So you're saying you believe, Peter, that LSCs did not buy enough to meet their local requirement by 120 megawatts?
Oh yeah, absolutely. It's in the annual deficiency report. And
okay. That's what you want the transparency, whether LSCs are procuring as much as.
Yeah, the point to some degree, Scott, is that the ISO publishes the deficiency report, and then they give LSCs a chance to make up those deficiencies. They don't report out sort of what deficiencies have been made up and what deficiencies have not been made up. And they don't. And the only time we know that there hasn't been a deficiency that wasn't made up, to some degree, is when they CPM and they decided that they CPM. But they have the discretion not to CPM for whatever reason.
Peter, you mentioned you had a couple questions. Have those been covered?
Yeah, those have been pretty much covered. Thank you for coming to the phones and taking a question.
So we should check to see if there are anybody else on the phone? Nobody else on the phone. Okay. All right. Thank you, Peter.
I did have a quick yeah, this is a smaller question, I guess. But in the case of a partial CPM where you're taking only part of a unit, what's the principle for determining the going forward fixed cost? Are you looking at the whole unit's GFCC and taking the fraction of that, or are you assigning? I don't know how. It seems like there's a lot of.
So basically we take the annual GFCC. Basically it depends whether they submit, whether we accepted a bid or no bid, but they're only getting a monthly sliver. They're not, if we make one CPM designation for 1 month, the unit is not getting its entire going forward cost for the whole year. It's getting a monthly sliver.
Okay, and I guess by partial, are we talking about partial of a year, or are there cases where partial of an actual unit?
It's partial unit. I mean, there's instances where we've taken 1 megawatt of course, CPM. It depends on the specific reliability need that needs to be met. It could be anywhere from a megawatt up to the entire unit. But a lot of CPM designations, are maybe designations up to the P-min of the unit. And again, the terms, I think Keith said that only in the history of CPM and everything that preceded it, we've only done 2 annual year-long designations, and that was for 2018. Other designations, if it's like an exceptional dispatch CPM, you're either getting a 1-month or a 2-month designation. If it's a significant event designation, it's for the term of the significant event. And we had one of those last year where, again, they were monthly, 1-month designations. And if the significant event continues, it can be extended. But, most of these designations that we've had in the history of backstop procurement have been, 1-month or 2-month designations, depending on whether the reliability need was system or local. And again, they've not all been for full units.
Okay, this is Ben, just to make sure that Jim's question was answered. So if you only need half the unit, then you get half of the units going forward cost.
And it's pro rata on a monthly sliver.
Okay, thank you.
So I just want to respond to that. Yeah, so Anthony's suggesting it's a monthly sliver.
Again, if you don't mind.
Okay, Michelle Quito, the CPUC. Anthony's suggesting that it's a small sliver, but let's recall that these units might also be under contract for the amount up to the amount that then, the remainder that then gets CPM'd. So it's not as if that's the only revenue source for that particular unit. So you could be getting a CPM for the uncontracted portion. So I want to make that point. The other point I want to make with regard to Anthony is he said we're not looking at the CPM, but I do believe that FERC asked for a holistic review of all of these processes for them to work together. And I think CPM compensation is one part of that. I also want to note that people are saying LSC deficiencies. It could also be that they're unable to get the capacity. So that's the market power issue. So I don't always want to suggest that it's LSCs are unwilling to go get the capacity. It's possible that they're unable to do so. I'd also like to note with regard to the RMR designations, Anthony's suggesting that, these were extraordinary. Well, we almost had another RMR this year with regard to Ormond Beach. The thing is, it came in before our bilateral process. We authorized Edison to go procure it, and the only reason we didn't go through the RMR process was we told them to go get it before our procurement process ended. So there are issues that I would like to raise. Let's see. You're paying. Okay, that's it for now. Thanks.
To clarify something that I think Anthony said, that the going forward cost is the going forward cost of a standard unit. It's not the going forward cost of the actual unit.
The cap itself is based on the going forward fixed cost of a mid-cost combined cycle unit, plus the 20% adder.
This has nothing to do with the actual going forward cost of a particular unit. So
that's right.
Say this is the going forward cost of a unit.
That's right. Now, if you want to recover costs above the soft offer cap, that is resource specific. You have to come in with the going forward fixed costs of your specific unit.
And how often has the CPM gone above the soft cap?
Never.
And do you take that as evidence about the level of the soft cap in one way or the other? Or?
I'm probably not in a position to opine on that. But we've never gone above the soft offer cap.
But I would just like to note that if you look at the RMR settlement, it's possible that the RMRs would go above the soft offer, and that's my issue about being able to choose which way you go. So if you're depreciated, you go to CPM and you get the cap. If you're undepreciated, you go through the RMR process.
Okay, and that was Michelle Quito from the CPUC. So actually, I think I started this can of worms by asking a question about whether 20% of GFCC, like how we should think of that. If I thought I heard Anthony say that FERC said that this is kind of meant to cover capital costs, going forward capital costs. And it sounds like we're sort of thinking this is sort of in the ballpark. And one other approach would be to just sort of look at the actual going forward capital costs. I guess given that nobody's actually above the soft cap, I'm not sure how relevant that would be either. But I expected your answer to be sort of like, look, if we're into that's what we consider to be an RMR process, and if there really is significant going forward capital costs that couldn't be recovered under a CPM, that you would expect that to be sort of requesting retirement and then maybe kicked into an RMR. Or maybe there's some other, I guess I'm wondering what your thinking was on why you don't just look at the going forward fixed cost.
Yeah, I think that's right. That would start putting it into the almost make it like an RMR where we've got a separate contract and a lot of termination and other provisions that I think it fits best under that, whereas CPM is really intended to be something much more streamlined, and based on the tariff, not negotiating a contract and things like that. But I think you're right. Once you start looking at a resources-specific capital costs and everything, that really is RMR, not CPM.
And I would think it also, to some extent, granted, each of them is a little complicated, even our proposal of what is there going for a fixed cost. But remember, they're going to be able, knowing what the formula is, to submit a bid into the CSP, the competitive solicitation process. And when we look at bids, we will certainly purchase the least expensive. But if we do end up at that bid price, that unit would be selected. We would be able to pay it that if they filed at FERC for that particular amount and it was approved. But it seems to me you enter into kind of a less certain area it's one thing to say what's its going forward fixed costs and maybe there's a 20% adder, but if you're now saying that the costs that are going to be able to be recovered are what you file at FERC and what FERC agrees to, and you then have to justify your capital costs, which I assume you're going to have interveners and protesters, then the certainty of the number that you have in the CSP, it seems to me, becomes with the approach, Jim, where you're saying, well, why not just have them file their actual capital costs, let FERC decide?
Anybody on the phone or anybody else in the room?
Yeah, this is Greg Cook. Jim, I'll add one more thought to that. We also got some FERC direction that to the extent possible, they wanted the capacity procurement to be as market-based as possible. We realize that, the system conditions are getting tighter. I think, but as the design of the CPM is, we're trying to allow for some competition in there for capacity procurement. The way I've always looked at the CPM is when you look at the soft offer cap, what we're really trying to do there is put in a proxy for what the system marginal capacity price would be. And then there's basically a safe harbor below that because, if we had an actual market where we were clearing capacity, where would we expect it to clear at? That's kind of how I approach this, and where you want to be setting that soft offer cap somewhere, as close to that estimate as you can get. And so, when we look at, I think it's reasonable when you looking at the going forward fixed cost of this proxy unit, you can assume that the marginal unit probably is one that doesn't receive a lot of energy market revenues, is probably a more inefficient unit, so you would expect that could be that marginal capacity unit, and that's why, that's kind of the rationale that I think of as to why, that's an appropriate way if we're trying to put in a proxy market power mitigation measure. That makes sense as to where you set that cap. And that's very different from what we're doing from RMR, where you definitely have a market power situation because we have to have this unit for a reliability reason. And then, if you're in a very uncompetitive situation like that, then cost of service is the appropriate rate to pay.
So a follow-up just on a collective deficiency sort of case. So you have a deficiency, and in my mind, I always had the picture of there's one unit that you absolutely have to have, but I guess from what I'm hearing, there's these effectiveness factors, and so there is still some opportunity to trade off some plants against another, and you just maybe there's a little too much of the less effective plants and not enough of the more effective ones. When you get into a CSP then, I assume the effectiveness is part of the sort of evaluation of bids. They're scaled by that. And is there a way for the existing RA so stuff that's already shown, how is that, is there a way for that to participate in the competitive? I'm trying to think about what you'd back off some and you'd increase others. Is there a cost minimization sort of calculation going on there when you're figuring out exactly who to ink and who to deck in that sense?
We don't get to ink or deck anything that's already it's already RA capacity. Only capacity that is not RA can compete in the competitive solicitation. So we're not maybe buying a unit more out of a unit in the competitive solicitation and telling an RA unit to back down as RA. We don't have any authority to do that. We're only looking at capacity that is not RA.
But to clarify that, this is Greg Cook. It's capacity that was not shown as RA. You know, one of the big benefits when we put the CSP in place in the first place was, you know, most months the LSEs are long on capacity and they're only showing the bare minimum that they need to meet their RA requirements, and they have this extra capacity that is under an RA contract, but it hasn't been shown as RA capacity in the ISO market. So the idea was, if you have another LSE that's short or we have to do some backstop procurement, they could bid that capacity into the CSP and, you know, basically get a rebate on some of those capacity costs that they've incurred. And so, you know, the expectation was we would have, you know, that you could have a significant amount of competition, particularly in the off-peak months for that capacity. You know, albeit, you know, we haven't seen huge amounts of bids coming into the competitive solicitation process. I will note, though, that last year when we were doing some CPM procurement as a result of some of the forecast issues we had over the fall, you know, we did that 2 months in a row. The first month there wasn't a lot of competition, but after we did that procurement the first month, we started to see significant increase in bids coming in that next month. So, you know, I think there is the opportunity that if you are starting to procure more capacity, that you'll start to see the competition increase.
Michelle, before we go to you, just quick, so in the CSP, how does effectiveness play in? So if one unit is effectiveness 0.5, another one is a unit of effectiveness of 1, you choose 0.5 if its bid was less than half of the other, for example.
Like an LMP calculation?
Yeah, that's the way to put it.
It's a cost minimization. I mean, we look to minimize cost.
Yeah, the tariff has selection criteria. There's like 4 or 5 of them, you know, and we go to cost. And at the end, you get to the point where if there's a tie, there's also a tiebreaker, but it's basically looking at cost. And then, you know, the minimum capacity that we'd have to procure and those types of things.
Let's see. So there's a hand here, but Shami, what was? Okay, Michelle had her hand out. Let's get Michelle, and then we'll go to the phone.
I just want to make 2 points. So I don't object to the monthly CPMs. I get it. There's capacity in the off-peak months that can fit into it. My objection really is to the Encina and Moss Landing where there was no other capacity. Encina was it. Moss Landing was it. With regard to it being more competitive for September and October, that's obviously because of the load forecast. The load forecast in September is high. It's lower in October. So you're going to have more resources that are not being shown for RA in October because the load is lower, hence more resources. So I just want to make those 2 points. Thanks.
Follow up then. So for the ISO, if Encina or Moss Landing were the only units that I guess there's a question of whether they were if you just looked at the physical plants in the system, were there others that were not offered in that could have been substitutes but were not offered in, or was it literally that they were the only physical plants that could have met your need?
I believe there were other units. I mean, I'd be jogging my memory going back, but there were other units or partial units that.
To object to that, in San Diego there were no other units. There was Encina, and in Moss Landing, it's not just the Bay Area; it's the South Bay Moss Landing area, and there are only very specific units that are available in that sub area.
Okay. And
Can I add a little to that? Interesting, though, they did not bid the cap. Moss Landing, Carrie Bentley with the Western Power Trading Forum. Just wanted to add that. I thought that was we're talking about incentives and it being a rational market and a cap, right? And in that process, because there wasn't perfect transparency and there was no guarantee that the CAISO would do the CPM because it's a may, not a must, they still took into account cost considered bid less than the cap. So I would say that, the current rules are working pretty well.
And in response to that, I'd say that these local areas are not rocket science. You know what they look like. You know how many resources are there in there. You make an educated guess. I'd just like to add.
So why don't you think they bid the cap then? Or why do you think they didn't bid the cap?
There's certain things that I can't say. So you have to know their other contracting positions. So that's first. The second thing is it is a may. It is not a must. And third, look at what kind of resource they are. Are they an old resource that might be fully depreciated, or are they a new resource that's not fully depreciated? I would just add that to the conversation.
So let's go to phone lines.
Caller, your line is unmuted.
Hi, this is Tyrone from PG&E, and I wanted to kind of opine a little bit on this, specifically on the South Bay Moss Landing. Just like Michelle described a little bit earlier, one of the things that is difficult is when you have a constrained area and all of the resources effectively are needed. And so specifically in the South Bay Moss Landing case, we had one resource that obtained an RMR, and then another resource that was just described, the Moss Landing unit, that actually received CPM. So we have two different compensation models that were given for the resources where all of them were essential. The other thing to make note of specifically for the South Bay or for the Moss Landing unit, as Carrie mentioned, yes, it did not bid up to the cap, but it was only, I think it bid like 12 cents under the cap, and it was only for I think 490 megawatts, and then the remaining megawatts of that unit was actually given the actual cap. So I'm only bringing this up specifically because in that case, or in this particular case, all the units, pretty much in that area for that constrained local sub-area was needed, but the ones that didn't have contracts, they received different forms of compensation. So I think in that sense where where there's gaps in this process, and resource owners are effectively identifying the procurement mechanism that allows them to obtain the highest procurement or maximum compensation, I think that's just a gap that doesn't lead to the best outcome.
And just to be curious, how inconsistent do you view the compensation as being? Was it one got twice as much as the other, or were they fairly close?
The thing is that, this is Tyrone PG&E. I'm not really sure. Again, if the RMR is based on cost of service, but then, and again, this gets to the fact that if you have cost of service, that in one sense for an undepreciated plant that makes sense, but then for one that is fully depreciated, then the soft offer cap makes more sense from in terms of maximizing compensation. So the fact that either one lends itself to either, I can't really tell you. I'm not really sure which one was better, but I just know it's different.
I can answer some of that question. I think in the RMR process, the Metcalf unit, I think, ended up settling for RMR costs around the soft offer cap. The Moss Landing unit that went through CPM, it was either 480 or 490 megawatts were a little below the cap, and about 20 megawatts or so were at the cap. So it ended up. That's capital costs. All right. The RMR also included capital costs for some of their upgrades, which were not included in the Moss Landing unit. Theirs would have had to been covered by their bids.
Yeah, I guess the point being is that for Moss, though, if Moss were cost of service, I'm not sure if its cost would have been exactly the same amount of what they bid in the CSP and what they obtained with the soft offer cap. That was the basis of my response.
So a question that we're worried about at the MSC is, in this situation where you needed everything, then the efficient solution, at least in the very short run, is to take everything, and how much you pay them is less consequential in the short run. But in the long run, you want incentives to keep stuff around that you want to keep around, and incentives for stuff to retire that should be retired. And that's the question here, is whether the different compensation designs might get us in the right or wrong direction in terms of these long-run decisions. The short-run case, if that's all you got, then how much you pay them is more an equity question than an efficiency one. But the efficiency comes up in the long run. Yes, Michelle?
So then if you pay an RMR the cost of service, are you sending the right signal for a new investment?
That's the question.
I'd say no.
Which I don't have the answer offhand, but that's what we've got to address.
I mean, for RMR, there's, also, the FERC basically says if your backstop procurement is something that must be accepted, it's mandatory. FERC case law requires you to pay the unit its full cost of service. So we're also working within those guidelines.
Right. I'm not saying that a long-run efficiency is the only criterion, and of course you've got to comply with the law and precedents and so forth. But we can't comment meaningfully on that, where we don't have that expertise. But we can think about incentives and efficiency. So thank you, Anthony. You're right.
And I just want to respond to Anthony sorry, Michelle. In the NYSO case, they did establish going forward fixed cost and sunk cost recovery, but they said if you go back to the market, you have to give back the sunk cost recovery. So they did address this, and they did not say that everyone needs sunk cost recovery and can go back and forth between the market. So that's in our comments.
And this is Sydney. I hope that committee members have had a chance to look at the draft final proposal. There is a page or two discussion of the toggling issues. Not all RMR structures are the same across ISOs, RTOs. New York has a voluntary arrangement. So even though the nomenclature might seem similar, we have different rules here, and FERC also understands that there's not a one-size-fits-all here. Our compensation is designed to pay for the 1 year of service that we have for each year of the resources under contract, and that includes any additional capital additions that are payable under the contract. The resource owner has to finance the capital additions. We only pay the yearly slice under the RMR contract, subject to the discussion on the termination fee, which they lose their return on investment on. So we do think we adequately, appropriately balance all these considerations and pay for the 1 year of service, and you only get your contract revenues for variable costs that would be clawed back over the course of the year if your market revenues exceed your contract costs.
Michelle, I thought I saw your hand. Is there any? No? Yes? Anybody else?
Yeah, sorry. The NYSO does, so yeah, NYSO is different, I get it, but they are concerned about two toggling. So this addresses one of the togglings, the capital expenditures. It doesn't address the other toggling, which is you get basically a floor of your cost of service and then you can return to the market. My other issue with regard to Calpine's comments earlier is I'm concerned that we pay market prices supposedly for 15 years and they come off and then they want to go to cost of service. And I think that gives us ratepayers the worst of both worlds, right? It's like when they're making money, it's in the market. When they're not, it's cost of service. So I'm not seeing it. That's me.
When we think about the efficiency aspects, I think when we're talking about these RMR units, usually this means there's an alternative of the transmission investment or running the unit. I mean, the efficient way would be to have a forward multi-year contract that the unit would compete with the transmission investment, and you do that instead of waiting until the crisis is upon you. Do this, have a forward rolling contract a few years in advance, and then if the unit didn't give a good price, the transmission owner could go ahead with the transmission investment. And if the unit owner underbid that, they could continue to operate the unit with a locked-in competitive cost. So that's, if we want to look at efficiency, that's the way to do it.
And This is Michelle Keto. We have proposed having multi-year RA contracts, but I would also note that CAISO is proposing multi-year backstop. So we are back in the same place we are. Yes, we are doing multi-year contracts, but I'm also saying CAISO is proposing multi-year backstop. So we're going to be in the same issue where we're competing backstop.
Well, if you do it in advance, you don't need to do the backstop. The idea is you do it on a forward basis before it's to the point of retirement.
Right, but we have people choosing the backstop. If you give them multi-year backstop, then they're going to choose that in the multi-year space. So that's not going to...
If you have to 5 years in advance, by the time they get to the end of the contract, you've built the transmission investment.
Right, but the transmission investment only relieves local transmission, and then it just becomes a system issue, right?
Well, then that's the competitive.
Right, if there is, okay.
And this is
but just to clarify, is there a multi-year backstop proposal?
No.
Okay, I wasn't aware of one.
Yes, this is Keith Johnson. I just want to clarify, at this time, the ISO is not proposing multi-year backstop. Our backstop mechanisms are currently only for at most 1 year at a time.
Sorry, Keith, in your proposal, Michelle Keto, in your proposal to the board about keeping flexible resources in, did you not propose multi-year backstop? I'll be happy to find it for you.
I'm sorry, I'm not flexible
Greg, I think
resources.
it was your presentation.
Michelle, this is John Gooden. As you know, Michelle, we did originally propose that and backed off, that we would see how the multi-year RA procurement would go. What we found is that in the PD, we were concerned that there was really no teeth in the multi-year procurement that the PUC was proposing in its proposed decision. That gave us pause and some concern, and so we did communicate in our filings that there's a potential that we'll relook at this if there really are no teeth. So, no, Michelle, we have not committed to multi-year backstop, but it's certainly something that could be on the table depending on how your ultimate multi-year procurement turns out.
And again, Michelle Keto from the Cpuc, teeth make sense only if it's because the LSCs are unwilling to procure. It doesn't make sense that they are unable to procure. I'll just say that.
Okay, let's talk about RMR. And so the first slide here, page 11, for those on the phone, is just, again, it's just to kind of set the stage, set the context for our discussion today, just illustrating for folks, you know, really the structure of the RMR, if you will, kind of a simplified view here. The three components really being going from the bottom up is an annual fixed revenue requirement that is determined for the unit. And under our proposal, we would only have going forward what has been known today as a Condition 2 type of arrangement where we would pay the AFRR and capital items and then any market rents earned above that would be clawed back. So the bottom piece is the AFRR. The RMR agreement also does allow for capital items. So what people often think of these as, you know, major maintenance capital additions. Those can be negotiated and included in the agreement, and so they're covered. That's part of the compensation structure. So that with the arrow, if you will, on the left-hand side there, trying to show you that really the capital items and the AFRR are the items that are included in the contract, and we make sure that the unit owner is paid for those over the course of the year through 12 monthly payments. And then the dotted line on the top is just to reinforce that there may be the potential for the unit to earn some market rents, but those are clawed back and they do not go to the resource owner. So that's really the construct for RMR, and we are not proposing to change that in a significant way. That's when earlier in the day when I'd mentioned we're not proposing wholesale changes to the RMR. What I mean by that is we're still going to claw back rents above the contract amount if they earn them. We're still going to allow for capital items to be included. We're still going to have an AFRR, which would be included. We are making a few refinements. For example, one of the features of the AFRR is that there is a rate of return that is allowed. We are updating that in this initiative, and that would be done through a kind of where the resource owner would need to file that and justify it individually at FERC. We previously had the MSC talk about this at the previous meeting, but we don't think it's really in play, if you will, for the MSC now because of the direction we've gone where basically the RMR unit owner would have to file at FERC for a rate of return and justify it. So there's really nothing for the MSC really to opine on. Before we were wondering if they had great ideas on what the fixed rate might be or how we might calculate a rate or a reference rate or a rate that changes over time. But with the way we've gone, we're not proposing something. We think that we need the opinion on that. So what we really wanted to tee up here, we tried to clarify, okay, so what would we like the MSC to talk about? So I guess you heard today, there's some different ideas about what we should be paying units that for a service that's mandatory in a circumstance where there certainly is market power. There's not a competitive situation, but we need the unit. So, does the MSC have concerns with us paying what we would describe the full cost of service as described in that previous slide? And basically what we're saying is we're proposing, like we have done historically, to pay it its AFRR, allow for capital items, and then clawing back market rents based on full marginal cost bids. And in the next section of the slides here, we do talk about the bidding. We'll go into that more, but what we're trying to accomplish here is the resource is going to be bidding its full marginal cost. So I'll stop there.
Well, I think as we've talked before, that the traditional treatment for market power is to pay the regulated rate of return, and that's what we do for other assets like transmission, so that's consistent with that. We do have to provide incentives for them to perform, which is an important issue, and that's where, the clawback, ideally would be structured in a way perhaps to incent them to perform in order to earn market revenues and claw back sort of expected market revenues, but if they don't perform and if the unit's not available, that they don't do as well. But
yeah, I think, I'm not sure if there's controversy over whether paying full cost is appropriate if we thought this unit was birthed as an RMR unit and stayed an RMR unit, had local market power. It seems like the controversy is the concern over it being able to cherry pick market versus regulated.
Can I also add one more concern? So let's say that you have a resource that it's otherwise economic but chooses to go this route, so then you pay full cost of service. So then you're trying to decide whether it makes sense to put another asset in that location to avoid the local market power or the transmission constraint. And you think, hey, this is a really great idea because I can avoid the full cost of service. But from an economic perspective, that unit should stay there. You should just, right? Because the going forward costs are very low for this particular unit. It gets revenue from the market. So then we're going to make an economically inefficient decision, right?
You're saying if a resource plan shows, okay, we can build a transmission line into this, and it's going to cost less than the
full cost
the spread between the full cost of service and some going forward cost. That would be a concern, yeah.
Okay.
I was talking about, you want to have a forward contracting process and let them compete.
Right.
And then make an efficient decision.
Right, but you can't compete if you only have one resource in the area. That's the problem.
It's going to have to compete with the transmission, so it'll get paid.
Yeah, and then it would be allowed to retire.
Right, but they're not. Okay. Let me think about that. I'm going to come back to that.
So, I don't know if you got your answer. There's there's some sense here that it'd be nice to have some incentive to operate efficiently. And so if you look at regulated assets in California, non-RMR assets that are regulated assets, rate of return assets, are there any performance incentives other than regulatory lag?
Well, and then I think maybe we can just defer this to the RAIM discussion, because that basically is the incentive that you're providing, right? And it seems like there's, one would have thought, if the concern that we had, which is, these guys are just getting paid cost of service, they're going to sort of eat a sandwich and not operate, but it actually seems to be the buy side of this that is most objecting to the RAIM, as I understood it in the comments, and so they view RAIM as overcompensating in a sense, or maybe as an inadequate. And I think it was Edison that made the comparison to a tolling agreement. And so, adding on to Ben's question about how regulated plants get incentives, I guess it raised the question of how tolling agreements provide performance incentives as well, and whether there's a model there that might be useful.
And just to clarify, RAM deals with availability incentives, but maybe not like heat rate incentives, right? But but it does partially address that.
I think people's concern was that the RAIM incentives apply to the performance hours and not to how you do over all the hours of the year, which may be relevant and for these units. And there are other, the tolling agreement structure, or Ontario is like the deemed revenue structure, where a unit calculate what it should have earned given market current prices, and what it would have earned in the day-ahead market based on the bids and prices, and then they're deemed to have made that money, and it's deducted from their cost of service. And if they didn't make that money, that's their problem.
Or if they do better than okay. Do have a question on the phone. Operator?
Caller, please go ahead.
Hi, this is Tyrone from PG&E. I just wanted to just put a pin in a thought that Michelle had mentioned a little bit earlier, in particular that with the ISO's current proposal that considers mothball requests for RMR designations, mothball requests have the ability to retire, but they don't necessarily have to retire. So if we do, in the instance where a mothball actually receives an RMR agreement and then transmission or some other solution is developed, that resource, once that contract ends, does not actually have to retire. It can continue to operate, can repower. It's a number of different options and alternatives that are available to it. And so I think one of the things that we've highlighted a number of times is that with the current approach, it's not really a true retirement mechanism, especially if mothball requests are considered for the RMR designations.
Thank you, Tyrone.
Yep.
Carrie?
Carrie Bentley with the Western Power Trading Forum. I had a question for the ISO. On Scott's point, going back a little bit, he said that ideally you'd want to be able to make the trade-off between transmission and an RMR or resource that's retiring. But I'm not sure how that actually works with the CAISO, because I thought our transmission planning process, if you were RMR, they actually assume that resource is still going to exist going forward. So I actually thought that this initiative would deal with that, a real retirement versus an economic retirement versus this new ability to make that trade-off. So I'm just wondering, is there an ability somehow? Is ISO assuming that an RMR resource maybe can be replaced with transmission through a process?
I don't want to speak for the planning folks, but I do know on a regular basis RMR units are being replaced by transmission and planned transmission. I mean, take the Metcalf unit. It was RMR in 2018. Transmission solution came in place. It's not RMR this year. And I think for like the Yuba City and other units that were RMR'd for 2018, we have transmission solutions plan that will, take them out of RMR in a couple of years.
I know all the New York units that were RMR. It was RMR until the transmission upgrade came in, then they were gone.
That's my point. We don't have a retirement process, and these aren't necessarily units that should retire. So now we're building transmission projects for units that end up not retiring.
Yeah, thinking through that, that argues for a different metric for deciding whether transmission should replace an incumbent unit, which is kind of a separable question from what the compensation should be in terms of the sort of social cost of trying to meet the reliability needs.
I mean, under our tariff, under FERC order number 1000, we're supposed to look at what is the more cost-effective or efficient solution. And that solution can be a transmission solution or it can be a non-transmission solution. So, but again, we're supposed to be looking at what is going to be the more cost-effective option.
When you make that trade-off, how would you consider the non-depreciated book value of the plant that's already there?
I would defer to the planning folks. I don't think you want a lawyer answering that question.
I think from this discussion, it probably shouldn't factor in, even though it does factor into the compensation.
It'd be best to have it be a bid cost so that, they can bid, if they want to compete with the transmission, they can bid lower. Transmission is a proxy. It could be storage, could be demand response, it could be, any sort of things.
And this is Michelle, and I would note if we had a retirement process where they identified themselves and we had the opportunity to do that, that would be great. But we don't. They can come in. They can come in a year ahead and give us that opportunity. They don't have to.
Okay, so I think we're scheduled to break at noon, so we have about 20 minutes to get through item number 4. So this has to do with the bidding rules, and I'm, in the interest of time, I'm not going to go down through each one of these bullets. I think most of you are familiar with our proposal. But basically, reminding you, we're talking about RMR here, so they're being paid their full cost of service. We're proposing that they would be submitting cost-based bids into energy and ancillary services markets. And there's some detail here about the bids. I wanted to go to the next slide, which I think is a good descriptor, because one of the things that we are talking about is making sure that the bids would reflect the total cost of the unit so that when the bids are seen by our market optimization, we're optimizing from among different units. And so these would be including both variable costs, major maintenance adders, if applicable, as well as opportunity costs, if applicable. And so in that sense, what we're trying to say is it's not just actual costs that we're going to have being bid in by RMR units, but what would be reflective of the marginal costs, okay? So that's really what we're trying to get at here. And that we would also note that in the last bullet of this slide here, that resources with the RMR agreements, they are eligible for bid cost recovery payments when the market earnings are insufficient to cover their fuel costs. But really what the point I wanted to talk about, and people, we can talk more about some of the details of these slides, is what we were really asking the MSC to think about, because I know some of our stakeholders have different opinions on how these should be bid, how often they should be bid, is do the way that we have set this up, where the RMR unit owner has the primary responsibility for submitting bids that reflect their marginal costs. And if they do not, the ISO will insert bids that are reflective of those marginal costs. Does this really, the way we've described it, would you agree that that's really a full marginal cost type pricing? And secondly, if we are doing that, is this really an efficient way to use the resources that are on an RMR agreement and not unduly distort prices in the market? So, because I think that that's one of the concerns of some of our stakeholders. They're asking whether or not having these resources bidding in at a certain price level is going to distort prices. So with that, I'll turn it over.
Just a clarifying question, maybe DMM can answer. So how does this compare to a default energy bid under LMPM? Is it the same formula? Do the major maintenance adders not get included in the LMPM context? In other words, is this a higher number than what would happen if LMPM was triggered? And what happens if LMPM is triggered? Does it go to the other DEB, or does it stay at this, or?
I think that's a question for that. So, what did you guys decide to do with the bids you guys are inserting for RMR resources?
I believe we generate all bid components, but not opportunity cost if they were to establish one. But we need to verify that. Otherwise, we're planning to calculate the default energy bids the same way we calculate default energy bids.
Under LMPM.
Under LMPM.
Yeah, okay, so that's what I thought they were basically the same, but you're saying there's maybe a difference with the opportunity cost.
Yeah, I believe that's it. I need to verify that.
Okay.
And could I ask another clarifying question? So you say you'll bid in the fuel cost. Is that going to be the market fuel cost, or is that going to be the actual fuel costs that are incurred under the contract?
Price, and then the cost recovery is based on the actual costs that are incurred.
And we are aligning the RMR contract to use the same gas fuel cost components that we use for all natural gas-fired resources. If there's a different fuel, then there will be a different fuel cost, but the gas price index will be used for generated bids and LMPM.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. This is Brian Thicker with NRG. I'll just briefly point out that aligning the contract with what the ISO uses right now does not guarantee and will not guarantee that the RMR unit will recover its fuel costs. We made that point in our comments.
And I guess another question I had was how maybe in the extreme thing in my mind where the RMR unit has local market power, that's why it's staying, would we expect LMPM to basically apply? I guess it's a capacity paradigm versus an energy paradigm, but I'm not sure what the answer to that is, but I would think that LMPM would be kicking in a fair amount of the time, even if there wasn't a.
But if it's a voltage support need, then there'd be no constraint, and so.
Unless if it's some non-transmission, conventional transmission constraint, or non-modeled transmission constraint, then that would be a different.
There was an issue raised by stakeholders that I wanted to ask a general question about, which is the local reliability need may be something that's predictable and confined to certain hours or certain months, and whether extending the obligation to those times that you're not meeting that need is something, at least one stakeholder suggested that the additional cost, and it might have been Brian, the additional costs involved in making the unit available the entire year as opposed to just when it's needed for the local need, is a good question as to whether in all cases the cost of making it available are really less than the benefits it would provide to the market. That it's perhaps there's some cases where you really only want to make the thing available for those predictable times that you have a local problem, that it's just not worth spending the extra money to make it available the other times. That was a question either explicitly or implicitly made in the stakeholder comments, and I'm wondering if anybody has anything to say about that. So Sydney, Stan, Michelle, Carrie.
So under the condition to form, which we are migrating to, the CAISO does have the right to tell the resource, not to bid in order to manage that kind of issue, and also manage contract limits. Speaking of the current form, so for example, under the current form, if we give it a local dispatch or commit the resource for a local need, there's a contractual obligation to submit bids for all the balance of the capacity into the market, and we can tell the resource, nope, we don't want you to do that. We want you just to meet the local need. So that will continue to be part of the Condition 2 form, so that can be and certain.
So if a resource owner says, this is going to cost us a lot more, do you really want to do this?
Well, you're talking more global. I mean, I'm thinking of more, micro scenarios and in a macro sense. I mean, I guess, we didn't contemplate that, but there's always an ability to file one-off RMR agreements if the situation would suggest that that's more appropriate because of the local need. But
Carrie?
Yeah, Michelle, Cpuc. But if we're paying full cost of service and covering all our costs and it's being bid in economically and only being dispatched when it's needed, I'm not really understanding where the benefit of that would be, right? I can see the cost of it.
Yeah, no, I guess the concern is that you are paying higher costs to make it available to just bid in when you're never taking it.
Well, I've asked the CAISO to do local, identify the local needs on a seasonal basis, and they say no. So they say there's always outages or something, so they need it all 12 months. Whether that's true or not, they can address.
Carrie?
Oh, there we go. Carrie Bentley with the Western Power Trading Forum. Yeah, I guess just repeating a little bit what they just said, if you think about some of the CPMs in the past, like the Dynegy Oakland units, if you force them to bid in at marginal cost or CAISO calculated marginal cost, you would have essentially caused them to break down over and over again. I mean, they were old dog units, right? And maybe marginal cost, even with major maintenance added in there, I think you would have ended up turning them on so much that it would have cost the market much more. I was unaware what Sydney was saying, that there was some flexibility under this proposal, so that might actually ease a lot of my concerns. So these unique units that really do need to retire and need to be replaced don't end up getting dispatched all the time and costing more.
It sounds reasonable, but it does raise questions about exactly what criterion the ISO should use to grant this exemption.
Other questions, comments on the phone? Nope. Okay, so let's march on.
Yeah, let's talk about rain. Let's talk about rain. I guess we talked about incentive effects a little bit, but
yeah, there's a lot of comments about rain, about that it doesn't appropriately reflect the value of the viability value of RMR units. And this was 11 p.m. on a Southwest flight over Nevada last night. I was trying to understand these, but that seems pretty controversial. I wonder if Keith wants to say anything about rain mechanism, applicability, RMR resources. Whether you think it's the right thing, or
we think that RAIN will work adequately for the RMR resources, just like it does for RA and CPM, because we think it's going to capture and make sure that they're bidding or scheduling for the appropriate hours of the day, most of the hours of the day. And that coupled with our ability to tell them, to manage outages. So, for example, we're going to be inserting bids if they don't. Otherwise, there'll be an expectation that they're going to be bidding, into the market. The RAIM is going to look at certain hours, yes, and they have some exposure there, but we're also going to be expecting them to bid 24/7, for example, if it has a local requirement. And we're not going to allow them to go out on planned outages, for example, if they want to take a planned outage, if it's for a period that we need them. So from a reliability perspective, we think we can make the RAIM work, coupled with our ability to kind of manage outages and manage the unit. So we think that it will work. I think really the crux of the argument of some of the other stakeholders is that they would like the unit to be, ensured to be physically available 24/7, for example, maybe in the summer months, all hours of the day, to really try to get additional energy value out of the resource. and that would really require a custom type of performance incentive. And one of the things we're trying to do is to streamline our systems, and automate them and allow us to treat RA, CPM, and RMR all the same. And that going forward, if we do change, for example, RAME, which we're thinking about, we're at least looking at it in the RA Enhancements Initiative, when we do make a change, it would apply to RA, RMR, and CPM all at the same time. So that's really one of our primary objectives is to try to
very
make this
different.
consistent.
I don't see that. That standardization is great, but not if they're serving different purposes. And I think the stakeholders have a good point that the RAME incentive is to incent them to have the capacity available when it's needed, but they're exposed to the energy market. So those units are in the energy market. If they don't do good, they lose money. But if we've got these guys under a different kind of contract where they don't have energy market incentives in there, because they're not in the energy market, because we're clawing all that back, then we need a different kind of incentive, because the RAM incentive is for units that are in the market. And when we take them out of the market, they don't have that incentive. So standardizing is great, but not if it doesn't really meet the same, if the units are different and you're not providing the same incentives. But that's, I thought the station was people was
So Carrie, and then we have a question on the phone.
Carrie Bentley with the Western Power Trading Forum. 2 points on the RAME. One, I was not, we objected to RAME for this policy for 2 reasons. One, if RMR is primarily used for local market power, and it is one of the only resources needed in the area, and that's why you gave it the RMR. If you go out on a forced outage, it's very hard to find substitution for it. So essentially, if you're on a forced outage, you're just going to be penalized because there's no way to mitigate for that forced outage, which seems fundamentally unfair and very different than the RA construct, where the premise of RAME is that you're able to mitigate these forced outages. The second point is, as Scott said, that the incentives are different. You could just generate a bid for RMR resources, and if they don't show up, you also always have the ability under the RMR contract to take them, to exceptionally dispatch them. So it's not like they need incentives to participate in the energy market. You literally have them under contract and can force them to. So I just think it's a very different and unequal application of an RA construct on a non-RA contract.
Let me make sure that I understand, Carrie, what you're saying about the first point for the first reason. So if it's needed for something local and there's no substitute, so if you go on a forced outage, then are you saying the problem is that the resource owner can't get a substitute and that's unfair?
Yeah,
or are you saying that the consequences to the system are much more severe to lose an RMR unit than to lose some sort of generic RA?
I'm saying the first one. If you go out on a forced outage, and you are a local resource, you can only substitute, quote unquote, with another local resource. So it's unlikely you'll be able to find another local resource.
Right, but to say that that's unfair, if that's the situation, there really are no substitutes, then the implications for the system of losing that unit are far more severe than losing sort of generic RA units somewhere in the system.
So that's why you have it under RMR. That's why it's not an RA resource. That's why you're paying at cost of service and you're trying to find alternatives. There's no economic need to have a penalty on top of that. It doesn't serve any purpose. The resource, I don't think, is going to be any more or less incentive to maintain their resource if you have this a penalty or not, right? Isn't the point of RAME to ensure that you maintain your unit so you don't go out on forced outages? I don't understand how this would do anything different since you already are under an RMR.
If one takes your argument to the extreme, I think you're saying that regulated units can be expected to perform just as well as deregulated ones generically?
I don't think so. I'm not saying my expectation is for them to perform or not. I'm saying an added small penalty on top of this won't do anything to change their practices. And if the point of this is to get them to change something, I'm asking, what are you trying to get them to change? What is the RAME penalty incenting specifically?
Okay, John.
John Gooden with the ISO. I'm just curious, Carrie, your argument would equally apply to many local RA resources that are actually pivotal. that aren't RMR. And so are you arguing that range shouldn't be applied to those types of resources as well?
Yeah, it's my understanding that's why in RA enhancements you are proposing to change RAIM completely because of stakeholder concerns for being able to get forced outage substitution. I mean, I think this has been acknowledged by the ISO. That's why you're proposing to change it.
Agreed, and what we're trying to do is align this with existing practice and new performance capacity D rates in the future. So,
but you're proposing to align it with something you're proposing to change. But then it'll change along with it. So the way to tariff RMR contract will point to the tariff in many respects. Right now we'll point to the RAIM, and as the RAIM changes, it will apply to the RMR resources. So if there's a local RAIM, that local resources, RA resources that are needed for local reliability, and we have an RMR needed for local reliability, you could true up the RAIM incentives through the tariff stakeholder process.
I'm not super vehement against this. I just think you have RA and you have backstops for RA and you have a program that works for that, and RMR is not that. So we should stop trying to apply RA concepts to RMR. And I know you say it's going to point to something that's going to change, but you're already saying RAIM doesn't work. I don't know how you're trying to logically tell me then we should apply it to RMR resources. If you feel the program needs to change for everyone else, then pretty much you're just saying we're going to apply it to RMR because that's what we're doing to RA resources, and then whatever we do for RA resources, we're going to do to RMR.
Well, I think the point is to tackle RA resources with local reliability needs. If resources had been picked up for RA that we needed for local reliability, there wouldn't be any RMR contract for that. So I think there is a logic to looking at the incentives in the RAIM and the RA enhancements proceeding and looking at resources that are needed for local reliability as opposed to other needs and having flavors of RAIM based on that.
Yeah, I think I just agree to disagree with you on that one. Yeah, I mean, Keith started this off saying we have CPM, and that's a backstop for RA, and we have RMR, and that's completely different. And so either they're completely different, and that's how we're setting up the structure, or we do it, as Michelle said in the beginning, and we do a holistic review, and we actually talk about a way to combine these programs, which I would be in favor with. But again, I'm not going to die on this sword. We don't care that much.
Okay. So your sword. If we could go to the phones, we have a caller, operator.
Please go ahead.
Hi, this is Tyrone from PG&E, and I just wanted to put a pin in some of the thoughts that were shared a little bit earlier as it relates to all of the resources being treated the same but then being provided different compensation. And that's one of the thoughts that we've kind of raised in the stakeholder process. The ISO, I think, has already described that they do have difficulty in being able to predict the reliability need. And one of the things that we've advocated for, specifically for an RMR resource, that number one, for that specific reliability need, but for that resource, that's the reason why it is obtained in RMR agreement. And because of that, it should be treated differently. And I think Sydney kind of alluded to the flexibility that is a part of the proposal. But one of the things the ISO, as I understood, has indicated is that RA, CPM, and RMR will be treated the same. So in one sense, I'm hearing the flexibility part, but then as we've gone through the process where we've kind of had difficulty digesting what the ISO suggested is the fact that all of them will be treated the same, but then they would all have different compensation. But for that unit, specifically for RMR, there are no other substitutes. So it's a little bit difficult to digest all of the pieces and the implications. But I know everyone's hungry, and I'm using the word digest 3 or 4 times. So I'm hungry too, and I'm just going to stop.
Okay, thank you, Tyrone. I can't think of a better note than to end the morning session on, except to thank Keith and John for the preparation for this morning and for stimulating the conversation. We look forward to interacting with you and perhaps stakeholders as we develop our opinion over the next month or so. Okay, so thanks. We're going to take a 55-minute break, come back here at 1, and we'll continue, then move on to the next topic on discussion, which is local market power mitigation.